Welcome to my channel of Gill Master Stories. Don't forget to subscribe button and press on the bell icon for more inspiration and mind-blowing stories. One diner, one bold confrontation, and a quiet act of courage that left everyone questioning their own actions. What would you do if you witnessed injustice unfold? Over lunch, it was a warm afternoon in Charleston, South Carolina, and the downtown diner buzzed with lunchtime chatter. The smell of freshly brewed coffee and sizzling burgers filled the air, mingling with the low hum of conversations and the occasional clink of cutlery. The kind of place where locals went for comfort, food, and small talk. It felt like a world away from the chaos of the busy streets outside. A young man, maybe in his late 20s, pushed open the glass door and stepped inside. His name was Calvin. He wore a plain gray hoodie and jeans, his work boots scuffed from a long day of labor at a nearby construction site. He was hungry, tired, and just looking forward to a quick bite before heading back to the job. But the moment he stepped up to the counter, he felt the atmosphere shift. The waitress behind the counter, a woman in her 50s with a tight-lipped smile and sharp eyes, paused. Her gaze lingered on him longer than necessary, scanning him up and down without greeting him. She spoke, her voice curt and indifferent. "You're gonna need to pay up front." Calvin blinked, unsure if he had heard her correctly. "I'm sorry, what I said. You need to pay before you order," she repeated louder this time. A couple of heads turned, their conversations quieting as they glanced over. Calvin glanced around the room. At least 10 other diners were seated, none of whom had been asked for the same treatment. He turned back to the waitress, trying to keep his tone calm. "Is that policy?" she shrugged, looking down at the counter like she couldn't be bothered to explain. "Just the way we do things sometimes." Calvin could feel the weight of the stares now. The old man sipping his coffee at the corner booth, the mother with her 2 kids by the window, the businessman scrolling on his phone near the entrance. No one said anything, but their silence was deafening. Calvin's stomach churned, not from hunger, but from the humiliation rising in his chest. He knew exactly why he was being singled out. But what could he do? Cause a scene, leave hungry, neither felt like an option. "All right," he said quietly, reaching into his pocket. He pulled out a crumpled $20 bill and handed it to her. "I'll have the meatloaf special." The waitress took the money without a word. Slapping a receipt onto the counter, Calvin took it and made his way to a small table in the corner. His appetite suddenly dulled as he sat. The din of conversations resumed, but he could still feel the occasional glance thrown his way. But Calvin wasn't the only one who noticed. A woman at the table next to him, an older lady with sharp eyes and a soft demeanor, had witnessed the entire exchange. She folded her hands over her coffee cup, her jaw tightening slightly. Calvin didn't look up, but she was watching. She had seen enough, but what would she do about it? That no one in the diner could have predicted. Calvin sat in the corner, his head low, pretending to scroll through his phone, though his mind was far from focused on the screen. He tried to ignore the sting of the moment, telling himself it wasn't worth making a scene over. But the weight of the situation settled over him like a heavy coat. Every glance in his direction felt like a spotlight, every whisper like a judgment. The waitress passed by his table with a tray of steaming plates for another customer, her expression unreadable. She didn't glance his way, but her earlier words lingered in the air like a bad taste. Calvin exhaled slowly, his shoulders sinking. He knew moments like this weren't new. This wasn't the first time, and it likely wouldn't be the last. But today it stung more than usual. At the table next to him, the older woman sipped her coffee, her eyes flicking between Calvin and the waitress. Her name was Elaine. She was retired, a former school teacher, who spent her afternoons in this diner with a crossword puzzle and a cup of decaf. She'd lived long enough to recognize moments like this for what they were: ugly, unfair, and uncalled for. Elaine leaned back in her chair, her crossword forgotten. She replayed the interaction in her mind, feeling a knot of frustration tighten in her chest. She didn't know Calvin, but she knew injustice when she saw it. It gnawed at her the way the waitress had spoken to him, like he was an outsider, someone undeserving of the courtesy given to everyone else. As Calvin's meal arrived, a plate of meatloaf, mashed potatoes, and green beans, Elaine glanced around the room. The other diners had returned to their conversations, their attention no longer on him. It was easier that way, wasn't it, to pretend nothing happened, to let the moment pass as if it didn't matter. But Elaine couldn't shake it. She stirred her coffee absent-mindedly, her fingers tapping against the ceramic mug. She had spent her life teaching her students to stand up for what was right, to speak out against wrongs no matter how small. Yet here she sat doing nothing. The irony wasn't lost on her. Calvin quietly picked at his food, eating without much enthusiasm. He kept his head down, avoiding eye contact with anyone, but he couldn't ignore the heat rising in his chest, the mixture of shame and anger that made each bite harder to swallow. He wanted to leave, to escape the silent judgment of the room, but something kept him rooted to his seat. Maybe it was pride, maybe it was exhaustion. Elaine set her mug down, her decision made. She pushed her chair back and stood, the sound catching the attention of a few nearby customers. She picked up her purse and walked purposefully toward the counter, where the waitress stood, but her words would spark a reaction that would ripple through the entire diner. Elaine approached the counter with steady steps, her heels clicking softly on the tiled floor. The waitress looked up from the receipt she was printing, her expression shifting into a practiced smile, one that quickly faded as Elaine didn't order anything. Instead, Elaine folded her arms, her voice calm but firm. "Excuse me," Elaine began, her tone carrying the weight of someone unafraid to be heard. "Can I ask why you insisted that young man pay up front?" The waitress blinked, her brow furrowing slightly. "It's just policy," she said, though the hesitation in her voice betrayed her. "For certain customers." Elaine raised an eyebrow, her lips tightening. "Certain customers," she repeated. "Funny. I've been coming here for years, and I've never once been asked to pay before I've eaten, nor has anyone else in this room, as far as I can see." The hum of conversation in the diner began to die down. Customers turned their heads, drawn to the exchange unfolding at the counter. The waitress straightened, shifting her weight uncomfortably. "Look, I don't make the rules," she said defensively. "I'm just following what the boss says." Elaine leaned in slightly, lowering her voice but not her intensity. "Then maybe you should consider what it looks like when you follow the rules, because from where I'm standing, it looks like you singled him out because of who he is, not because of anything he did." Calvin, seated at his table, overheard the conversation. He froze his fork halfway to his mouth. He felt a mix of embarrassment and gratitude swelling inside him, unsure of how to react. The other diners were now openly watching, some whispering to each other, while others simply stared. The waitress flushed, glancing around as if searching for an ally. "It's not what you think," she muttered, her voice lower now, almost pleading. "I didn't mean anything by it." Elaine straightened, her eyes unyielding. "Intent doesn't erase impact. You didn't mean anything by it." Well, it certainly meant something to him. She gestured toward Calvin, who looked down at his plate, his face tense. The room grew still, the weight of the confrontation pressing down on everyone. A man near the door, a younger man in a button-up shirt, stood up suddenly. "She's right," he said, his voice cutting through the silence. "I've been coming here for months, and I've never seen anyone ask to pay up front. What happened isn't okay." Others began murmuring in agreement, nodding their heads. The waitress looked around, her defensiveness crumbling under the collective gaze of the room. Calvin finally looked up, meeting Elaine's eyes for the first time since he walked in. He felt something shift, not just in the diner, but in himself. He gave her a small, almost imperceptible nod, his way of saying thank you without words. The waitress took a step back, her hands trembling slightly, as she tried to salvage the moment. "Look, I didn't mean to cause trouble," she said, her voice shaky. "Maybe I shouldn't have done that." Elaine didn't let her off the hook. "It's not about avoiding trouble, it's about treating people with the respect they deserve." But as the conversation continued, it became clear that the issue wasn't just one bad moment, it was a reflection of something deeper. Something no one could ignore any longer. The tension in the diner was palpable, the air thick with unspoken truths that no one could avoid anymore. The waitress, now visibly uncomfortable, fidgeted with her apron. As more customers murmured their agreement with Elaine, she seemed unsure whether to stand her ground or back down completely. Calvin, still seated at his table, felt a mix of emotions, relief that someone had spoken up, but also annoying frustration that such a moment had to happen at all. He pushed his plate aside and stood, drawing attention from the room. "Look," Calvin said, his voice steady but filled with quiet intensity. "I'm not here to cause a scene. I just came for lunch, but what happened today? It's not about the money or even the food, it's about how you made me feel. Like I didn't belong here, like I had to prove something. Just to sit down and eat." His words hung in the air, resonating deeply with the customers, who were now listening intently. Elaine turned back to the waitress, her expression softening slightly. "You hear that this isn't about you being a bad person. It's about taking responsibility for your actions and understanding how they affect others." The waitress hesitated, her defenses cracking under the weight of the moment. She looked at Calvin, her voice quieter now. "I'm sorry," she said, her eyes darting around the room. "I didn't mean to make you feel that way." Calvin studied her for a moment, his expression unreadable. Then he gave a small nod. "Apology accepted," he said simply, though the hurt in his tone was still evident. But the moment wasn't over. The man in the button-up shirt near the door spoke up again. "This isn't just about one person apologizing. It's about recognizing that this kind of thing happens all the time. And not just here. We all need to do better." The room grew quiet again, the weight of the man's words sinking in. Elaine nodded in agreement, adding, "It's not enough to just be sorry. Change has to follow." At that moment, the manager of the diner emerged from the back, clearly alerted by the growing commotion. He was a wiry man in his 40s, with a harried look on his face. "What's going on out here?" he asked, his tone sharp but cautious. Elaine didn't miss a beat. "What's going on is that your waitress just discriminated against this young man, and we're all trying to figure out if that's how you run your business." The manager's eyes widened slightly, and he glanced between Elaine, Calvin, and the waitress. "Of course not," he stammered. "That's not our policy. I'll make sure this doesn't happen again." Elaine crossed her arms. "It shouldn't take a public confrontation for you to notice what's happening under your roof. This isn't just about one employee. It's about the environment you've allowed." The manager nodded, clearly chastened. "You're right," he said, his voice subdued. "I'll address it. I'll make changes. Thank you for bringing this to my attention." Calvin finally spoke again, his voice carrying a quiet strength. "All I want is to be treated like anyone else. That's it. If you can promise me that, then maybe this place really can change." The manager nodded solemnly. "You have my word." The waitress, still standing behind the counter, looked at Calvin with an expression that was equal parts regret and reflection. "I'll do better," she said softly, her voice barely above a whisper. But as Calvin left the diner that day, he realized the true impact wasn't just on the waitress or the manager, it was on everyone in that room, including himself. As Calvin walked out of the diner, the sun hit his face, warming his skin in a way that felt strangely comforting. After the tension inside, he took a deep breath, letting the moment settle. He wasn't sure if things would really change in that diner or anywhere else, for that matter, but he knew one thing for certain. Today someone stood up for him, and that mattered. Inside, the atmosphere had shifted. Elaine returned to her seat, her coffee now lukewarm. The other diners exchanged quiet glances, their conversations subdued. It was as though everyone was processing what had just unfolded. The waitress leaned against the counter, staring at the cash register as if it held the answers to questions she didn't know how to ask. Her actions had been called out in front of everyone, and while it stung, a part of her knew it was necessary. She thought about Calvin's words, about how she had made him feel, and for the first time, she truly understood the weight of what she had done. The manager, now standing awkwardly near the counter, cleared his throat. "All right, folks. He said, addressing the room, "I want to apologize for what happened today. That's not who we are, and it's not who we want to be. I promise to make changes, so this kind of thing doesn't happen again." The diners nodded silently, some offering small words of agreement. Elaine gave a slight smile, satisfied that her voice had made a difference. Even if it was just a small step. Later that evening, Calvin recounted the experience to his younger sister. As they sat on the porch of their modest home, he spoke about Elaine, about the man who had spoken up, and about the strange mix of shame and empowerment he felt during the whole ordeal. "You think they'll really change?" his sister asked, resting her chin on her hands. Calvin shrugged, a faint smile on his lips. "Maybe, maybe not. But if we don't call it out when it happens, nothing ever will." Back in the diner, Elaine stayed a little longer than usual, finishing her crossword puzzle and reflecting on the day. She knew she couldn't change the world, but she also knew that small moments like this, moments where someone chose to act rather than stay silent, could create ripples that traveled further than anyone realized, and that was enough for her. The next day, the diner posted a sign on the front door: "We welcome everyone, and we are committed to fairness and respect for all." It wasn't much, but it was a start. For Calvin, for Elaine, and for everyone else who had witnessed what happened that day. The message was clear: standing up for what's right, even in the smallest moments, can make a difference. It's a reminder we all need sometimes, that change starts with courage. If this story moved you, don't forget to like and subscribe to the channel. For more content, please leave your comments and share your experiences. Thank you for being part of Gill Master Stories community. See you soon.